videos, we discussed regarding the steps of aerobic respiration, where we studied how single molecule of glucose undergo various steps of aerobic respiration to yield energy in the form of ATP. We studied how one glucose molecule get oxidized to produce 36 ATP. But we are not only consuming carbohydrate, we also eat proteins, we also take fats. What about these proteins and fats? Will they give any energy? Yes, as you all know, proteins and fats also provide energy in the form of ATP itself. But how exactly these proteins and fats yield energy or give energy? They give energy by undergoing aerobic respiration itself, or these fats and protein also undergo respiratory pathway to produce energy in the form of ATP. Anyhow, priority wise, it is the first carbohydrate which is in the form of glucose undergo aerobic respiration to produce energy. After that is fat and last is protein. That's why during the diet, dietitian asks you to eat very less amount of carbs or carbohydrate, because only after oxidation of all carbohydrate, the protein and fat comes into picture, or fat and protein get oxidized to produce energy. First, we'll brush up how carbohydrate get oxidized to yield energy. So first carbohydrate get broken into simpler form, that is glucose. Later glucose undergo glycolysis, that is glucose changes into glucose 6-phosphate. Later it is converted into 6-carbon compound, that is fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. This 6-carbon compound later splits into 2,3-carbon compound, that is dihydroxyacetone phosphate and glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So this compound later converted into pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid after oxidative decarboxylation provides or yields acetyl-CoA. Later this acetyl-CoA undergo Krebs cycle. So during which lots of ATP, NADH and FADH2 are produced. This NADH and FADH2 now enter electron transport system and ATP synthesis to produce ATP. So carbohydrate or one molecule of glucose after undergoing different steps of aerobic respiration yields 36 ATP. So that is about carbohydrate. What about fats and protein then? Both fats and protein cannot enter the respiratory pathway directly, or as it is they cannot enter the respiratory pathway, or they can't enter the first step of the respiratory pathway as it is. First, both fats and protein need to be broken down into simpler form. Then only they can enter the respiratory pathway. So we'll discuss about that one by one. First one is fat. Fat before entering the respiratory pathway is broken down into fatty acid and glycerol, and it is based on the what type of fat. If it is a monoglyceride, that is broken down into one fatty acid and glycerol. If it is a diglyceride, it is broken down into two fatty acid and one glycerol. If it is a triglyceride, it is broken down into three fatty acid and one glycerol. Anyhow, fats before entering the respiratory pathway, it broken down into fatty acid and glycerol. Now, if the fatty acid were to be oxidized, or if the fatty acid need to enter the respiratory pathway, then it should undergo beta oxidation and should produce acetyl-CoA. So, fatty acid before entering the respiratory pathway will undergo beta oxidation to produce acetyl-CoA. So, fatty acid will enter the respiratory pathway in the form of acetyl-CoA. Now, this acetyl-CoA undergo Krebs cycle. Next, glycerol. If the glycerol were to be oxidized, or if the glycerol want to enter the respiratory pathway, then it should convert into dihydroxyacetone phosphate, or glycerol enter the respiratory pathway in the form of dihydroxyacetone phosphate. Now this dihydroxyacetone phosphate undergoes series of reactions to produce pyruvic acid. This pyruvic acid later undergo oxidative decarboxylation to produce acetyl-CoA. Now this acetyl-CoA undergo Krebs cycle to produce energy. So that is how fats undergo aerobic respiration, or fats undergo respiratory pathway. So that is about the fat. Now we'll talk about protein. So protein enter the respiratory pathway only after the degradation. So proteins are degraded by the enzyme known as proteases. So these proteases enzyme convert the protein into simpler form known as amino acid. So many number of amino acids are formed from the single protein. These amino acids consisting of amine group and carboxyl group. Later, from these amino acids, the amino groups are removed by the process called as deamination. So, during deamination, the amine group of the amino acid is removed and it will be converted into different compounds like pyruvic acid or acetyl-CoA or any other compound that is present in the Krebs cycle, which is purely based on the structure of amino acid. So based on the structure of amino acid, after deamination, the amino acids are converted into different compounds like pyruvic acid, acetyl-CoA or any other compound. Usually, most of the amino acid after deamination are converted into pyruvic acid. Later, this pyruvic acid undergo oxidative decarboxylations to produce acetyl-CoA and this acetyl-CoA undergo Krebs cycle to yield energy. So that is how protein enter the respiratory pathway or protein undergo aerobic respirations to provide or to yield energy in the form of ATP. So that is about how carbohydrate, fats and protein enter respiratory pathway to yield energy in the form of ATP. So in the respiratory pathway you have studied some of the larger compounds are broken down into smaller compound and that process is called as catabolism. Similarly, there is a synthesis of larger compound from the simpler compound also. For example, if the glycerol is required by the cell, then dihydroxyacetone phosphate compound will be withdrawn from the respiratory pathway and it will be produced glycerol. Similarly, if the fatty acid is required by the body, then acetyl-CoA, that compound will be withdrawn from the respiratory pathway to synthesize fatty acid. So in the respiratory pathway, there is a catabolism as well as anabolism. Catabolism means broken down of the larger compound into simpler compound and anabolism means synthesis of the larger compound from the simpler compound. So both catabolism and anabolism are present in the respiratory pathway or respiratory pathway shows both catabolism as well as anabolism. That's why respiratory pathway is also known as amphibolic pathway. So amphibolic pathway means having both catabolic reaction as well as anabolic reaction. That is why respiratory pathway is also called as amphibolic pathway. So that is all about amphibolic pathway. I hope this video will be useful. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.